Hello, chefs. In this bonus episode of the show, we'll be talking about taste and how it's often confused as talent. Today, we debunk that theory. I am Mark Grigsby, your chef and guide through this experience, and this is the IncrEDIBLE Discourse.
All systems go.
Welcome to this bonus episode of the show. So, to kind of explain why this came to be, when I was planning and designing the show for season 2, I had so many ideas. And as I started to sort through them to set our 24 episode season, I realized some of them were just too good to discard. Many of them are foundational ideas and perspectives. And I felt that this would help young chefs and young cooks and home cooks understand in depth the processes and philosophies of cooking. So today's topic in particular is one of those. So I won't go into updating you about the show or myself as I usually do in the regular episodes, because as avid fans, you already know those things, right? Besides, this episode is being released in between regular episodes, so you truly get a bonus. 3 straight weeks of an episode. So let's jump right into it today, and we're talking about taste is one of those things people talk about like it's magic. You either have it or you don't. You're born with a good palate or you're not. And some people can taste things and the rest of us are guessing, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that that idea is completely wrong. Taste isn't a gift. It's not a talent. And it's definitely not reserved for professionals or people with years in a kitchen. Taste is a skill. It's built through repetition. It's sharpened through calibration. And it's strengthened every time you taste something. Think about it and make a conscious adjustment. So, in today's episode, we're going to break down what taste actually is, not the romantic version, right? Not the social media version, but the real practical thing that chefs train for over time. We'll talk about why experienced cooks seem to just know what a dish needs, right? And why that confidence looks like talent from the outside, but what's really happening behind the scenes. Because what you're seeing is an instinct. It's a memory. It's years of tasting food that was too salty or not salty enough or flat, bitter, unbalanced, and learning exactly why it missed the mark. It's failing quietly, adjusting deliberately, and paying attention long enough for patterns to stick. And here's the part that matters most. This isn't just for professional kitchens. Home cooks can train their palate the same exact way. By tasting with intention, slowing down the adjustment process, and learning to trust repetition over recipes. You don't need fancy tools or culinary school or a refined chef palate. You just need awareness, patience, and the willingness to be wrong. By the end of this bonus episode, you'll understand what taste really is, why it's trainable, and how to start strengthening it in your own kitchen without intimidation, without ego, and without feeling like you're behind. Because if taste is something you can train, then no one is locked out of becoming a better cook. When we talk about taste, most people lump it into the same category as intuition. They'll say things like, oh, well, I'll just go with my gut, or I'm going to trust my instincts. And while that sounds confident, right, it's also where a lot of confusion starts because taste isn't tuition and it's definitely not preference. Taste is recognition. Intuition is a feeling. Preference is what you like. And taste is the ability to identify what you're experiencing, compare it to what you've experienced before, and then decide what needs to change. And that's an important distinction. You can like food that's poorly balanced. Shit, we all have been guilty of that. And you can dislike food that's technically sound. That's also a possibility. But neither of those things mean you understand what you're tasting. And understanding food means you can answer questions like, what's dominant here? Or what's missing? Or maybe, what's out of balance? And so, what direction does it need to go? Like, those questions are important questions, but if you don't know how to identify, it's not an instinct, it's memory. And taste lives in the space between your tongue and your brain. And the more often that connection is used deliberately, the sharper it becomes. And this is where the idea of taste as talent starts to fall apart. If taste were instinct, repeated exposure wouldn't really matter. If it were a gift from the heavens above, experience wouldn't change it. But the opposite is true. The more you taste, the more you recognize. The more you recognize, the faster you decide. And that's not talent, that's training. And from a scientific standpoint, this tracks perfectly. The brain doesn't store flavor as a single sensation, it stores patterns. It remembers salt levels, acidity, bitterness, sweetness, texture, aroma, and how all of those elements interact. And every time you taste something intentionally, you're adding another reference point. That's flavor memory. And like any other form of memory, it gets stronger with repetition. This is why repeated exposure matters so much. It's not about tasting more food, it's about tasting more situations. Food that's underseasoned, food that's over-acidified, food that's rich but flat, food that's aggressive instead of balanced. And each one teaches your palate something specific. And here's where professionals often get misunderstood. When someone watches an experienced cook season a dish without measuring, it looks like natural-born confidence. Or worse, it looks like magic. A little pinch of this, a splash of that, a quick taste, and bam, suddenly it's right. But what you're actually watching is recall. They're not guessing. They're not comparing. That cook has tasted this type of dish maybe hundreds of times. And they know what it tastes like before it's seasoned. They know what it tastes like when it's almost right. And they know what it tastes like when it's gone too far. So when they say something like, it needs acid, that's not intuition, that's pattern recognition. They've tasted flat food before. They've tasted food that had enough salt but no brightness. They've tasted the difference acid makes at different stages in the process. And their brain recognizes the pattern, and the decision feels immediate. And this is why professionals make faster decisions, not because they're gifted, but because they failed more times than most people ever see. They've oversalted sauces. They've reduced things too far. They've burned aromatics. They've drowned food in acid trying to fix blandness. And every one of those mistakes created a benchmark. And that benchmark becomes a warning system. It tells them when they're close to the edge. It tells them when something is missing instead of broken. This is a critical shift in how we think about taste. Mistakes aren't proof that you're bad at cooking. They're the raw material that taste is built from. The problem is that most people don't taste their mistakes long enough to learn from them. They fix something and move on, and never pause to ask why it went wrong in the first place. That pause matters, because liking food doesn't train your palate. Analyzing it does. You can enjoy a dish and still miss what makes it work. You can also dislike a dish and completely misunderstand why. Understanding food requires attention, not approval. And that's why taste is trainable. You don't need a refined palate to start. You just need a curious one. You need to taste and ask questions. You need to compare versions of the same dish. You need to notice what changes when you add salt versus acid versus fat. Every time you do that, you're building reference points. And reference points are what make decisions faster and more confident over time. This applies just as much at home as it does in a professional kitchen. The difference isn't environment, it's volume. Professionals get reps and reps and reps and reps. Home cooks just need to be more intentional with the reps that they get. So if a taste feels mysterious right now, that's not a flaw. It just means your palate hasn't been trained yet. And training doesn't start with confidence, it starts with paying attention. Because once you understand that taste is recognition and not instinct, everything changes. You stop waiting to feel the answer and you start learning how to see it on the plate, in the pan, and on your tongue. That's the foundation. Early in my career, I was convinced I had a decent taste. Not great, but good enough to get by, let's say. And then I kept running into the same problem over and over and over and over again. I was either over seasoning things or under seasoning them. And there was no in between. One day a sauce would be flat and the next day it'd be aggressive, and I couldn't figure out why I kept missing the mark. In my head, I was doing the same thing every single time, every single day. Same recipe, same process, same feel. But then one night, a chef I was working under tasted the same dish I had just tasted. And I remember thinking it was perfectly fine. Maybe not perfect, but close enough, right? And then he tasted it and paused for half a second and said, "Man, this is heavy. You went too far." And he didn't raise his voice and he didn't yell at me. He didn't explain it in technical terms either. He just knew. And that bothered me because we were tasting the same food, but hearing two completely different things. And at first I chalked it up to experience. I figured maybe he just had better taste than I did. But as it kept happening, something started to click in my mind. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't reacting emotionally. He didn't hate me. He was recognizing something I hadn't learned to recognize yet. So I started paying attention. Not just to what I liked, but what was actually there. I started tasting things even when I didn't enjoy them. Bitter ingredients, acid-forward dishes, flavors I normally would have avoided or dismissed as maybe it's not my thing. And that was the turning point. I realized that disliking a flavor doesn't excuse you from understanding it. And if you're serious about cooking, you don't get to skip tasting something just because it's uncomfortable or unfamiliar. You still have to program your palate to recognize it, to know what too much looks like, what balance feels like, and how it behaves in different contexts. That's when I stopped cooking blindly and started cooking consciously. Growth didn't come from talent. It came from exposure, feedback, and a ton of humility. From being wrong enough times to build memory instead of confidence. Because taste isn't instinct. It's memory, built through repetition. And that shift from cooking blindly to tasting consciously is where everything starts to change. And the good news about this is you don't need a professional kitchen to make this happen. You don't need years of experience on the line. You don't need expensive ingredients or some mythical chef palate. You just need to turn palate development into a habit instead of an afterthought. For home cooks, this is where most people miss the opportunity. They taste at the end. They follow the recipe. They plate the food. They take a bite. And then they decide, oh, well, it might be good or it might not be. But at that point, you're no longer cooking. You're judging. And judgment doesn't teach your palate anything. Tasting at every stage is how you learn. Before seasoning, after the first adjustment, after the second adjustment, before the sauce reduces, after it tightens. Each taste gives you a data point. And each one of those data points teaches you what the food is doing in real time. And just as important as tasting often is how you adjust. One of the most common mistakes I see at home is dumping seasoning. A big pinch of salt, a heavy splash of vinegar, a handful of cheese. And when the flavor is off, people tend to overcorrect. And that's usually how dishes go from bland to broken. Gradual adjustments build understanding. Small additions force you to taste again and taste again. And tasting again is what trains your palate. You're not trying to fix the dish in one move. You're trying to learn what each move does. This is also where balance comes into play. Most flavor problems at home aren't about missing salt. They're about imbalance. Salt, acid, fat, and heat all work together, right? So when one is out of line, the dish feels wrong. But it's easy to misdiagnose the problem. Something tastes flat, so we add salt. It's still flat, so we fucking add more salt. And now it's salty and fucking flat. And what it probably needed was acid or fat or a little heat to wake it up. And understanding that balance only comes from comparison. You have to taste, adjust, and taste again while paying attention to what changed. That's how you stop guessing and start recognizing. Another trap home cooks fall into is relying entirely on recipes. And you know how I feel about this, right? Recipes are helpful, especially early on. But they can't taste your food for you. Ingredients vary, brands vary, heat levels vary. Even your cookware changes the outcome. A recipe is a starting point, not a verdict. If you follow it without tasting along the way, you're skipping the most important part of the fucking process. The goal isn't to reproduce a dish perfectly. It's to understand why it works when it does and why it doesn't when it doesn't. And that's where tools and small habits can really help. Measuring spoons are great. Don't get me wrong, right? As long as you treat them like training wheels. Use them to establish your baseline. See what half a teaspoon of salt actually tastes like in a pot of soup. And then learn what a tablespoon of acid does to a sauce. And then taste it again. Over time, those measurements stop being rules and they start becoming references. Keeping acid within arm's reach makes a big difference too. Remember, we've talked about that the last 2 episodes about having your little flavor board. Vinegar, citrus, and even pickled liquids. They're tools for balance, not just flavor. Having them ready encourages adjustment instead of resignation. And one of the most effective exercises you can do at home is tasting side by side. Taste something unseasoned, then taste it after you season it, and then taste it again after acid. That contrast is powerful. It trains your palate to feel the difference instead of guessing at it. That's how confidence is built. Not through bold moves, but through repetition and awareness. Because mastery doesn't come from being fearless in the kitchen. It comes from being attentive, from tasting often, adjusting carefully, and letting each dish teach you something new, even if you've had that dish a million times. The more you do it, the quieter your doubt becomes. And the more your palate starts to speak clearly, even at home, is a building block. One of the most common mistakes I see, and I've made it myself more times than I can count, is trying to fix everything at the very end. You get all the way to plating, you take that first bite, and something's off. So you panic a little bit. And then you add salt. Then you add more salt. Maybe a splash of acid, maybe some fat, and suddenly the dish goes from almost there to completely fucked and out of balance. And that usually doesn't happen because you don't care. It happens because you didn't taste throughout the process. Most people are afraid of ruining a dish. They don't trust their palate yet, so they hesitate. They wait. They tell themselves, well, I'll fix it later. But by the time later comes around, the food has already locked into a certain direction, and now every correction feels risky. The fix is simpler than most people expect. Taste early, adjust lightly, taste again. That's the process. Small corrections are where confidence is built. Not because you're making bold moves, but because you're giving yourself feedback in real time. Every time you taste and make a minor adjustment, you learn something. And then you start to understand how much salt actually moves the needle, right? You see how acid changes the shape of a dish instead of just making it sharper. And then you learn when to stop. That repetition matters more than getting it right, quite honestly. Consistency beats confidence because confidence comes later. Once you stop waiting until the end to make decisions, cooking becomes calmer because you're no longer reacting, you're steering. And the more often you do that at home, the more familiar those flavor patterns become. Which brings us now to the other side of this conversation. Because while home cooks are learning to trust their palate through repetition, professional kitchens take that same idea and they turn it into a system. They don't rely on confidence. They rely on standards, benchmarks, and repetition under pressure. And that's where taste stops being personal and starts becoming collective. So next, let's talk about how professionals manage taste on the line and why consistency matters more than instinct when the heat is on. In a professional kitchen, taste isn't personal. It's operational. That's the biggest shift from home cooking to cooking on the line. At home, you're cooking for yourself or a small group, right? But in a restaurant, you're cooking for volume, speed, and consistency. And when pressure enters the room, instinct becomes very unreliable because now you need systems to take over. That's why professionals don't train taste during the service. They train it before the doors open. Tasting happens during the prep, not in the middle of the rush. Sauces are tasted when they're built, not when fucking tickets are spewing out of the printer. Stocks are adjusted before they're reduced. Dressings are dialed in before they ever hit a plate. So that by the time service starts, flavor decisions should have already been made. During service, there isn't time to think. There's only time to execute. And this is something a lot of young cooks struggle with. They want to season to taste on the fly. They want to adjust in the moment. But in a professional kitchen, that's how inconsistency creeps in. One cook seasons one way, another cook seasons another way, and suddenly the same dish tastes different depending on who's working the station. It's chaos, right? And that's why chefs don't season to taste during service. They trust the system that trained their taste ahead of time. Those systems starts with batching and ratios. Bases, sauces, vinaigrettes, soups, all of them are built with standardized seasoning levels. Not because chefs don't trust their palate, but because consistency matters more than personal preference. Once a baseline is established, everyone is working from the same reference point. That baseline becomes the standard. From there, tasting isn't about deciding if something is good. It's about verifying that it matches the benchmark. Does it taste like it's supposed to? Is it still within range? Has an ingredient changed enough to require an adjustment? That's a very different mindset than guessing. Training cooks to taste with purpose is one of the most important and most overlooked parts of kitchen leadership. Too often, young cooks taste just to see if something is good, but that's vague. It doesn't teach anything. Purposeful tasting asks better questions like, is this balanced? Or is it consistent with yesterday? That's a good one. Is it consistent with what we did yesterday? Is it within the standard? Or what changed day to day, vendor to vendor, season to season? Those questions turn tasting into a skill instead of a habit. And benchmarks matter here. When cooks know what tastes right, they don't have to rely on instinct. They can compare, they can correct early, and they can do it all without ego. As kitchens grow and teams get larger, this becomes even more important. One of the hardest things to manage in a professional kitchen is calibrating multiple palates to a single standard. Because everyone comes in with different backgrounds or preferences or tolerances. Some people like things saltier. Some prefer more acid. Some shy away from bitterness. But none of that matters in a professional setting. The dish sets the standard, not the cook. That means training taste across stations. It means tasting together. It means chefs explaining why something is adjusted, not just that it needs a fucking adjustment. It means reinforcing the same benchmarks day after day until they stick. It also means accounting for ingredient variability. Because produce changes, proteins change, salt behaves differently depending on moisture and fat. Acid hits differently depending on temperature and reduction. Professionals don't pretend ingredients are static. They expect variation and train for it. That's why systems matter more than recipes. A good system allows small adjustments without breaking consistency. It gives cooks permission to correct within boundaries instead of guessing fucking wildly and shooting in the dark. It keeps the end result stable, even when conditions change. There's also a side of taste training that rarely gets talked about. Waste. That's one of my favorite topics. We talk about this all the time, waste. Because the overseasoned product costs money. So does reworking a broken sauce. So does refiring a dish because it's unbalanced. Taste isn't just about quality, it's about efficiency. When cooks taste early and often during prep, problems are caught before they scale. When benchmarks are clear, fewer things need to be remade. When seasoning is consistent, fewer plates come back. Taste becomes a cost control tool. That's something a lot of people don't realize until they're responsible for the food cost. Every unnecessary adjustment, every refire, every we'll fix it later decision adds up. Systems protect the food. It protects the guest experience. It protects the bottom line. And this is where the myth of talent completely collapses. Because professional kitchens don't rely on gifted palates. They rely on trained ones. They rely on repetition, standards, communication, discipline. Taste is shared, reinforced, and maintained. It's not improvised. The best kitchens aren't the ones with the most confident cooks. They're the ones with the clearest systems. When taste is treated as a discipline instead of a personality trait, everything improves. Food becomes consistent. Teams become aligned. Stress decreases. Mistakes get smaller. And most importantly, growth becomes predictable. Because whether you're cooking at home or running a line, the truth stays the same. Taste doesn't come from instinct. It comes from attention, repetition, and respect for the process. Under pressure, that's what holds. Taste development demands humility before it ever rewards confidence. And that's the part most people struggle with, especially early on, young cooks. We always want to be right. We want to feel capable. We want to believe our instincts are enough. But taste doesn't respond to ego. It responds to attention. Every cook who truly grows has to accept the same reality. You're going to fuck up and be wrong more often than you're right at first. And that's not a flaw in the process. That is the process. Humility is what allows you to taste something and admit that it's off without defending it. It's what lets you hear feedback without taking it personally. It's what keeps you open long enough to learn instead of locking into habits too early. Repetition does the rest. Taste isn't built in moments of inspiration. It's built in quiet, unglamorous repetition. Tasting the same sauce every day, adjusting by small increments, seeing how ingredients behave over time, paying attention when something doesn't work instead of just brushing past it. Those repetitions don't feel dramatic, but they compound. And over time, your palate gets sharper, your decisions get faster, your corrections get smaller, and what once felt uncertain now becomes familiar. And attention is the thread that ties it all together. You can cook for years without developing taste if you're not paying attention while you're doing it. You can follow recipes and hit temperatures and execute techniques perfectly and still miss the lesson if you're not tasting with intention. Attention turns experience into knowledge. Respecting the craft means accepting that mastery isn't something you're just handed. It's something you earn by staying present long enough to notice patterns, recognize imbalance, and correct course without fucking losing your mind and panicking. The cooks who grow the most aren't the most talented. They're the most disciplined in how they pay attention. They don't rush the process. They don't skip the tasting. They don't already assume that, hey, I fucking know, puff out my chest and do all that extra whatever. They stay curious. They stay open. And they keep showing up willing to be corrected. That mindset doesn't just make food better, it builds better cooks. Because once you understand that taste is earned, not gifted, progress stops feeling intimidating and starts feeling inevitable. Today's final thought leads us to this. Taste isn't something you're born with, it's something you build. And like anything worth building, it doesn't come from getting it right the first time. It comes from mistakes. from dishes that missed the mark, from moments where you tasted something and realized this isn't it yet. Every one of those moments teaches your palate something valuable. Not what success looks like in theory, but what it feels like in practice. Too salty, too flat, too heavy, too sharp. Those aren't failures, they're reference points. And without them, taste never develops beyond fucking guessing. The cooks who grow the fastest understand this early, and they don't rush the process or try to skip steps. They taste often, they adjust deliberately, and they reflect long enough for the lesson to stick. Because that reflection matters. Because tasting without thinking is just, it's fucking eating, right? But tasting with intention and paying attention to what changed and why it changed and how it affected the balance, that's how flavor memory is built. That's how decisions get sharper. That's how confidence becomes earned instead of borrowed. And here's the most important part. This has nothing to do with talent. Talent doesn't make you attentive. Talent doesn't slow you down. Talent doesn't force you to ask better questions. Attention does. The cooks who improve the fastest aren't the ones chasing bold flavors or flashy techniques. They're the ones who show up curious, who stay present while they taste, who are willing to admit when something is off and patient enough to figure out why. They don't just cook more, they learn more from what they're cooking. So wherever you are in your journey, be it home kitchen, professional line, or somewhere in between, don't wait to taste. Build it. One adjustment at a time, one mistake at a time, one conscious taste at a time, because the truth is simple and it's empowering. The cooks who grow the fastest aren't the most talented. No, they're the most attentive. And attention is something you can practice every single day, no matter where you are, home, professional, in between, practice. Sometimes the most important work we do as cooks happens off the line and away from the stove. And how we think, how we taste, and how we pay attention. And that's exactly why I wanted to take the time to have this conversation with you guys outside of our regular episode flow, right? So, before we wrap this up, I just want to say directly, thank you for spending time with me today. Bonus episodes like this are a little bit different. They're quieter, more reflective. They exist because sometimes the conversation doesn't fit neatly into a standard episode format, but I still feel like it's important enough to have. This today was one of those moments. And if something in this episode stuck with you, maybe it challenged you to think about how you taste, or maybe it challenged you to taste, or maybe it just gave language to something you felt but couldn't quite explain before. Like, I would genuinely like to hear about it. Share your thoughts, your experiences, or even if you fucking disagree with me and you want to put that out there, do it by using the hashtag #IncrEDIBLE Discourse. This show has always been about conversation, not lectures. And if you want to keep digging into this kind of thinking beyond the mic, you can always find me over at theincrediblediscourse.com. That's where I take these ideas and slow them down even further with blogs and deeper breakdowns and downloadable resources you can actually use in your own kitchen. It's not flashy. It's just tools meant to help you build skill, understanding, and confidence over time. And if you want to support the show in a more tangible way, take a look at the IncrEDIBLE Discourse merchandise while you're there. You see my shirt? We just got our shirts in, guys. Look at my shirt. Anyways, every piece is rooted in the same philosophy that we talk about here. Respect for the craft, trust the process, and put skill before ego. Supporting the merch helps keep this project independent and lets me keep having conversations just like this one. Most of all, I appreciate you guys. Whether you're cooking at home, grinding on the line, or just trying to get a little better every single day, you're the reason why this show exists. So until next time, stay curious, keep tasting, and don't stop building the skill. I am Mark Grigsby, and this has been an amazing bonus episode of the IncrEDIBLE Discourse.